Lately, I've noticed that when I'm reading, specifically like a novel, my mind's eye defaults to imagining scenes in a distinctly cinematic style. An author will describe a scene dripping with rich figurative language, and my brain will make an image that always feels like a movie. The movement, the composition, the tone, it all plays out like a film, one with deliberate cinematography constantly observed from the third person. There's a part from the first page of Heart of Darkness, establishing the enclosing setting of the book. It describes how the sea and the sky were welded together without a joint, in a haze resting on the low shores that runs out to the sea in a vanishing flatness. Barges drifting up with the tide, their sails sharply peaked. The city to the west is darkening the sky, condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding motionless over the biggest and greatest town on earth. In my case, I find it almost impossible to imagine the sunset scene on the Thames estuary in any terms other than a montage of exactly what Joseph Conrad describes. The horizon blending together in a moody haze, a tangle of ships in their riggings, and to the west the smoke of London's industry dimming the otherwise brilliant golden light of sunset, a contrast between the purity of the sea and the grimness of civilization. I guess it's hard to communicate effectively without relying on actual visuals, which is a testament to a writing skill that I don't have. But this is my visualization process. But to be more specific, what are the details of that visualization process? If I were to break down the mode in which I visualize the contents of a book, I think I should first identify the different ways it manifests. For instance, I think my images are always static, no camera movement, and only natural motion from the objects in the scene. The images of the river meeting the sky with no perceptible boundary is captured in my head with no subjective movement, simply a static shot of waves and clouds. If an element of the scene is singled out more for its sound or some other kind of sensory element, I usually imagine a shot of the narrator or main character's reaction to that element, not necessarily the sense itself. If it's the character focusing or remarking on something, I think a close-up or a medium shot of that subject is my default. Dialogue between two people often works in a standard back and forth shot reverse shot kind of coverage. If it isn't obvious, this has all been informed by my consumption of modern filmmaking. I'm even using film terminology to describe it, since it so naturally correlates. The framing, the camera movements, and even the cinematography, the visual language that I'm defaulting to has a distinctively modern vocabulary defined by Hollywood conventions for the last several decades. But literature has existed for much, much longer than that. Like, Heart of Darkness was only published just as motion pictures had been invented, when it was seen as like a cute novelty and there was not even a definitive name for the medium. Conrad certainly wasn't trying to evoke the feeling of something that wouldn't come into its own for at least another decade. And Conrad is least among other authors from before, who never had filmic conventions to lean on while writing descriptive passages. This begs the question, do movies affect the way that we imagine books? Like, how does a constant intake of a visual medium like film train your mind to invent images in your head in that style? Have our visualization habits changed over time with the rise of film as an art form? So, let's get down to it. The question at hand is, how has the history and progression of the art of cinema affected our mental imagery while reading books? I read a lot of stuff, so buckle up. So before digging into the research, we need to cover some vocabulary. I guess the first one we should settle is, well, mental imagery. The definition seems maybe intuitive, but we need to stress that imagery in this sense has to do with more than just mere visualization. In this context, we're taking imagery to mean the fifth definition listed in Webster's. We're talking more about abstract or indirect representations, or facsimiles, phantasms, whatever, of a real thing. Mental imagery encompasses all the different experiences that can be mapped to your different senses, like the classic sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. So mental imagery is like your mind inventing representations of those senses inside your head. Now, these different kinds of sensations, as you experience them in your mind, are what we call phenomena. That word can mean slightly different things in different contexts, though. The way we're using it here, it will mean specifically what you're experiencing from a subjective, first-person point of view. It has everything to do with what's going on in your head, regardless of where those thoughts or sensations originated. When I mentioned just a bit ago how your mental imagery can manifest through senses, you can consider the act of perceiving them as a phenomenon. You thinking is a phenomenon. You feeling is a phenomenon. In a sense, the term simply is a way to break down the inner workings of your conscience into discrete elements that we can poke at. Now, the last and pretty major concept here is embodied cognition, two words that sort of need defining in their own right. Cognition specifically refers to the brain's ability to acquire, process, store, and retrieve information. It's like the way your mind understands the world, maintains context, and continually ties it in with all those inputs. Embodiment, on the other hand, has to do with the role that your body and its accompanying sensory experiences play in your lived experience. Embodied cognition, therefore, is when your cognition becomes dependent on your sensory system to act out your experiences, so to speak. Embodied cognition describes, for example, how your entire perception of reality is not just in your head, but also has links to your senses. Think of it as bridging the gap between everything that is strictly going on in your mind with what you're detecting from the outside world. Embodied cognition asserts that you can't keep those two separate, they're indelibly connected with one another. So try and imagine a cat. You just know how petting the cat might feel. Your mind able to basically simulate the feeling of its not quite silky fur softly gliding underneath your fingertips. Maybe you can imagine it purring, that steady roll just clearly playing in your mind's ear. From an embodied cognition perspective, you simply can't think about feeling or hearing the cat without triggering, on some level, the actual sensory system. And this, of course, ties us full circle back into mental imagery. It's deeply linked to an embodied experience that encompasses all of your senses. I think we have enough of the basics covered. A superficial understanding should be enough here. But let's move on. So, from all my reading, a pattern I noticed is that a lot of this research appears to be disjointed and applied differently. Probably the most glaring thing to acknowledge is that any academic attention towards the subject before, 1950, was at best philosophical. Cognitivism as a field of study didn't really emerge until the mid-20th century, which by then the art form of film had already matured through different phases. Meanwhile, since the emergence of phenomenology and cognitive psychology as a field of research, the ability to measure those things quickly ran into limitations around objectivity, and most studies, even until today, only seem to be able to do qualitative analyses. As a result, the body of research, or at least what I've been able to uncover, doesn't seem to have a lot of consensus in general, and academic sources that examine the role of cinema, if at all, couldn't go back far enough to give any long-term insights. So, all of that in mind, the closest thing to a coherent framework for categorizing mental imagery by different modes of embodiment came from this 2014 paper. The framework is something of a taxonomic model, one where they define domains of imagery and stances through which the reader experiences the imagery. This results in 4 modes of imagery that describe how the reader embodies the experience. Domains in this context can be either referential or verbal. Referential refers to the imagery of what is being described in the scene. Like the author refers to the details of what is going on. This is the more intuitive idea of mental imagery, where your mind's eye, and to some extent other sensory elements, are aiding your imagination. Verbal, on the other hand, is a little less intuitive to understand. It has to do with the processing of language, the way that you are perceiving the mere words from the page. While a bit reductive, it may help to think of this in terms of where the verbal domain is happening. Verbal images are phenomena that don't occur in your mind's eye, but like your mind's ear. Despite there not being any actual audio, the brain's circuitry used for language processing still internalizes the words on the page and their encoded sounds in the same way as it would if those words were spoken aloud. So, stance, the other half of the model, has to do with the amount of embodiment your sensory system is doing. It's a bit different from simple POV. As the paper says, all mental images are necessarily internal to the imager's body. However, the actual images will differ in the degree to which the body is felt to be actively at work. As such, different degrees of stance will fall on a continuum from fully inner to fully outer, as in completely subjective or simply detached. We'll see how these play out in a bit. But first, I want to start with the verbal domain, since it should clear up some lingering confusion. Speech imagery is our first, and it's experienced through the outer stance. I think the simplest way to understand this is to just call it your mind's ear, although that downplays what's going on a little. The paper describes it as the vicarious listener, as if you're almost hearing the words as they are spoken from some disembodied voice from the page. I will say that speech imagery as a phrase is confusing, but try to keep in mind the definition of imagery that we're working with. Speech imagery is probably most often experienced when reading passages of dialogue in a book, where you're imagining, say, Hagrid's voice, for example. This mode requires a little less embodied effort to process, so it might be the easiest to experience. Rehearsal imagery is the other verbal mode, which naturally now dips into the inner stance. This is the mode where your own voice begins to assume the words on the page. And because this one does involve more embodied effort, no, this isn't strictly referring to your inner voice. Rehearsal imagery extends to the subtle embodiment of your own, vocal cords moving. I know this one seems a little out there, but maybe if you give yourself a chance to sit down and read something, you may notice that it's not just your mind's voice that is reading, but your speech apparatus is almost trying to move on its own without producing any sound. At some point, the connection just seems to stop. So hopefully those weren't terribly confusing. These final two should be a little bit more intuitive. The first of our referential mode, description imagery, is your outer imagined experience. This mode, like speech imagery, requires less embodiment, if any at all. This one is where you're a vicarious observer, or as the diagram in the actual paper says, visualizer. Anyways, perhaps for observers, description imagery is the most common mode of imagery, where information is presented through the text and you construct just a mental picture, maybe to a lesser degree a smell or feeling of air temperature or something. You aren't fully embodying the perspective of any character, but observe them from inside the scene based on the description in the text. Interestingly, this might result in you reading slower as you're less immersed and not on autopilot. You may even notice the cognitive labor invested in the imaging process on some level. In my case, this is where I believe the film-like nature of visualization might appear. But that's weird, because we just talked about two others that I also recognize in myself. Anyways. Finally, enactment imagery is the next referential mode, but experienced from the inner stance. This would be a situation where the reader fully submits to the first-person subjective experience. It's the creme de la creme of embodied cognition. Reading a rich figurative passage would transport you into the place of the character. It would elicit the same sensations they feel at every level. This, while reading, is certainly possible, but the paper acknowledges it to be fleeting, only existing for brief moments. The load on your sensory system almost overburdens it, and unless the conditions are perfect, you'll probably slip out of this mode just as soon as you slip in. I think a similar, non-literary example are those guided meditation things, where the narrator leads you to focus on every sensation described to the point where you get transported and immersed and almost become hypnotized by how convincing the mental picture is. So those are your 4 different modes of mental imagery, which cross between fully embodied to not so much, and from experiencing them to merely hearing them. But we have more findings to cover. I think I'm going to go get a snack, probably an apple or something. I think now is a good time to briefly bring up what became a bit of an elephant in the room. It was mentioned in the majority of papers that I looked at, and it's something very significant to acknowledge. Some people simply don't have the ability to visualize things mentally, as though their mind's eye can't render something clearly, if at all. This phenomenon is called aphantasia, or aphantasia? Aphantasia, which is simply that, the lack of the ability to visualize in your mind. You may have seen this Apple scale with different levels of fidelity. What it represents are the different levels of details that someone with aphantasia could potentially imagine. On the standard, regular Fantasia side, you can picture a 3D apple in like 8K IMAX and turn it over in your mind, look at it from any angle that you want. On the full aphantasia side, you get nothing at all. And of course, there are steps in between. It's not exactly common, but it does throw a wrench into the idea that everyone can visualize books like movies. Maybe most people can, though? Let's turn our attention now to a new finding from a different article. Remember, my ultimate question that I'm trying to get to the bottom of is why cinematic visualization habits pop up when reading. One paper that's definitely worth highlighting explored the role that illustrations play when reading illustrated novels, at least through the minds of like 9-year-olds. Regardless, it sheds some light on the way that mental imagery can be coaxed or influenced. The study followed several school children, with the author checking in on them as they completed assigned readings of 3 different books, each with decreasing dependence on illustration. The children were interviewed as they read through these books and were asked questions to ultimately aid in answering whether illustrations can act as scaffolding for mental imagery, a rough structure on which more detailed images can be built. Children had natural picturing tendencies, and each of them reported varying experiences with the images. Interestingly, the Midnight Zoo, which contains mainly abstracted illustrations like silhouettes, don't appear to significantly aid in things. Where illustrations were clear and consistent, though, children mostly assumed that they were definitive and began to replace them as their own mental images, or enhance what they were already imagining. Admittedly, this was not really an experiment in the strict sense, more of an exploratory investigation into how research could be directed in the future, so the findings aren't really scientific fact by any means. And yeah, I know that this study looked at illustrations and how they add a vague structure that our minds will eventually fill in, but the way this could tie into my question is that it's clear that existing imagery may add some amount of assistance with building your own mental imagery. taking everything we've learned so far into account. This could likely also apply to speech imagery. Like, you don't just hear Hagrid's voice when reading, but you specifically hear Robbie Coltrane as Hagrid.
As a matter of fact,
The study also touched on how mere familiarity with the subject plays a role too. It might not be that much of a stretch, therefore, to assume that a visual diet of movies would build a vocabulary with which a reader could start to assemble a distinctly cinematic mental image. But that also begs the question of what other vocabularies could exist. What if you don't like movies in that way? What if you're a gamer? The last paper I want to look at may have been the closest I could find to my question. However, it had to do with perspectives, as in the point of view that your mental imagery takes. In the study, there were two sets of hypotheses tested, and both add some context to what I'm trying to uncover. The first set of those hypotheses had to do with reading habits, and 1, whether those increase the likelihood of visualization in the first place, and 2, if that increased likelihood also increases the chance of assuming a character's perspective. Maybe not super surprisingly, these were supported by the study, showing that people do assume perspective of the character in a story more if they read frequently. But also looking at the data, we see that out of the whole sample, the majority of people, when combining frequent and infrequent readers, will usually visualize partially or not at all from the character's perspective. Granted, this was a binary between either that or exclusively assuming the character's perspective, but this does implicitly acknowledge that people can slip into one mode or the other, which also backs up the observation that enactment and description imagery, our referential domain from earlier, have different levels of mental energy required. The other part of the study tested if readers who also play video games more frequently are more likely to assume the perspective of the character in a work of fiction. And as a bonus, they predicted that there would also be a positive correlation between the visualized point of view and the point of view of the games that they preferred. Like, first-person shooter people will visualize novels from the first person. None of these hypotheses were supported by the data, which I thought was unsurprising at least. In fact, this portion of the study seemed a little flimsy, and I could have told you that playing video games and reading books are two very different cognitive experiences. But if you allow me to glean one note from the second set of hypotheses, the finding, or rather lack of finding, could be interpreted that the type of media that you consume might not necessarily relate to the mode that you visualize with. As in, just because you play games a lot doesn't mean your mind's eye will imagine novels like a video game. Or just because you watch a lot of movies doesn't mean... So after all these findings, I don't think I'm any closer to finding an answer. In fact, I think the science ended up showing that I was asking a question that might not be ready to be answered. The only conclusive thing I discovered is that mental imagery is an insanely varied and diverse kind of cognitive phenomenon. It can manifest in so many different ways, with your brain switching between them without you consciously noticing. And as I read through these papers, an important realization set in. Really, my own assessment of how I visualize narrativity isn't even correct. See, I latched onto the cinematic language thing so hard and I was so certain that it was just how everything worked. But I came to realize that I do have plenty of moments where I embody the rest of my sensory system. I identify with pretty much all 4 of those modes that we discussed at the beginning. When primed, I do tend to switch in and out of subjective perspectives. I don't stay in cinema mode the whole time. Sometimes I don't visualize things in any amount of fidelity at all. And after reading all of this, all I can say is that I'm probably normal. But in this area, normal just means that you aren't super narrow in how your brain makes images. And ultimately, all that made me realize that the original question is kinda, dumb to begin with, and is based on a very egocentric assumption. It turns out I'm making a fatal flaw by assuming that my visual process is the same as everyone else's. What I found is that there's anything but a standard mode of visualization. Even though I only highlighted 3 main sources of information, the other 7 documents I read, plus supplementary stuff, made it abundantly clear that the expansive mental phenomenon people have going on in their heads, in any combination, is diverse enough to practically be unique to each individual. And furthermore, the exact nature of each of these different experiences is too niche to be measured in any meaningful capacity. I mean, I could probably have cherry-picked several lines from any of the dozen articles that I read to motivate my initial reasoning, but truthfully, the most valuable thing was learning just how ignorant to other experiences I am, not even considering that other people experience the world differently. Although, when I phrase it like that, duh, it's kind of embarrassing. So, at the end of all this, let's turn our attention once more to the original question. Do movies affect the way we imagine books? And how has that changed through time? Well, I think from what I've learned is that this is an almost impossible question to answer so far. Cognitive studies like this simply haven't been around long enough to get a sense of how people's visualization habits have changed over time. And for modern readers, objectively measuring anyone's embodied experiences is nearly impossible. Where does that leave me though? There might be some merit to the question, but it would need some reworking. Some of the points that I brought up earlier hint at the fact that we may have a form of visual vocabulary that can be built up over time. And while those references can come from literally anywhere, there very well could be a way that a certain proclivity for filmic style would work its way into those outer visualizations. Maybe I haven't been diligent enough in my research, or maybe this really hasn't been investigated before. Either way, I learned something in intellectual humility, so it's not a complete wash.